All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to what has been a research workshop thinking about third world approaches to international law and Palestine in the midst of genocide, featuring some 36 scholars from around the world, including Palestine and as far as South Africa. It's been a really productive time, and we're culminating in this public lecture. Today is day 241 of genocide, and the invasion of Rafah has begun with unprecedented cruelty. Not only have Israeli attacks killed 195 Palestinians, but it included the burning alive of children, babies, and others seeking refuge in plastic tents that consume them, revealing that there are, in fact, no red lines. As of May 30th, some 36,000 Palestinians have been killed, the majority of them children. 30 of them are victims of malnutrition and dehydration. As of today, OPT has announced that there are no bakeries functioning in Rafah, that the public health concerns in Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah are beyond crisis levels, according to the World Food Program, and that Jadaliyya refugee camp, and Beit Lahia, as well as Beit Hanun, are quote-unquote disaster zones. We knew that this would be the case as early as October 9th, when Yoav Gallant told us that there would be a total siege, and when he reiterated it on October 20th, when he said there would be a full siege with no electricity, no food, no fuel, when he said that Israel is fighting human animals. Only 5 weeks later, on November 17th, the World Food Program warned that with only 10% of necessary supplies, that the entire population was already, quote, in desperate need of food assistance. And the International Court of Justice told us on January 26th, and again on May 26th, that this was a catastrophic humanitarian situation. Together, we've witnessed 12 flower massacres, airdrops that have killed children, and fathers who have drowned in search of sustenance for their families. We watched newborns suck on dates, and other children weep in exhaustion upon spilling the food that they waited for hours to receive. We also watched a $3.2 million US-built port crumble in one of the grossest ironies of this moment. The last time that starvation was advanced as a legitimate and legal method of warfare was in 1863 in the Lieber Code. And here we are, 161 years later, fighting against the use of starvation as a method of war. And in this fight, we are incredibly lucky to have the unique experience of being led by one of the most adept scholars, advocates, and beautiful human beings, Professor Michael Fakhri. Mr. Fakhri is a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches courses on human rights, food law, development, and commercial law. He's also the director of the Food Resiliency Project in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center. His books include Sugar and the Making of International Trade Law, and a co-edited volume, Bandung, Global History and International Law, co-edited with one of our members here, Vasuki Nesai, which was cited by the International Court of Justice. He's taught courses on the right to food at Harvard Law School, and this list is very long. I'll skip through it. But during his practice as a lawyer, Professor Fakhri fought for the rights of people who were indigent and incarcerated in a psychiatric institution. He was appointed as the special rapporteur on the right to food by the Human Rights Council in March 2020 and assumed his function as of the beginning of May 2020. Please help me in welcoming Professor Michael Fakhri.
You know, talking to a room full of strangers is easy, but when it's mostly your friends and comrades, I'm nervous. These are lovely people. And to the people I don't know, thank you for coming today. Thank you to the Sawyer Seminar, Afterlives of Liberation, Africana Studies at Rutgers, to NYU, to the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School. My warm thanks to Noura, Arakat, and my other comrades from Third World Approaches to International Law that asked me to speak today. As you heard, we're coming out of an amazing 2-day workshop on international law in Palestine that was held just upstairs. And my talk today, the reason I'm nervous is my talk today relies heavily on the work of many of those that are in the room right now. As some of us say in Lebanon, merci ktir. I'll be speaking to you from my experience as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, but I'm speaking in my personal capacity as a middle-aged man who's happy to be away from his family, but misses his cherry tree, which is full of cherries right now. That's how much I care about Palestine, that I'm willing to give up cherry season. So what I'll do is I'll just explain what a Special Rapporteur does. My mandate is on the right to food. So one way to think about it is I'm the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, famine, and malnutrition from a human rights perspective. Another way to think about the job is, my job is to learn from everybody, to talk to everybody, and to somehow process what I'm learning and to share it publicly as often as possible. I present 2 reports a year, once to the General Assembly, once to the Human Rights Council. And in many ways, this position puts me in a position of authority as to speaking to the right to food. What does it mean? What does it mean in a lot of different contexts? What does it mean in the midst of a pandemic and a food crisis? What does it mean in the midst of a genocide? What does it mean in particular countries? I've been closely following, I've been closely tracking Israel's war against Gaza since October. Never in modern history has a people been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely. In fact, there are many elements that are unprecedented. Never have children been pushed into malnutrition so quickly. Never have been so many children been killed or maimed in a war. Never have so many humanitarian workers and UN staff been killed in a war. Never have so many journalists been killed in a war. By December, 80% of the world's population facing famine were in Gaza. But it's important that we don't present these elements or statistics as part of an argument. We should not have to explain why the humanity of Palestinians matter. Nor should we have to compare different instances of atrocities or horror to justify acts of solidarity, resistance, or liberation. I mention these points because there's something to the fact that since the COVID-19 pandemic, we keep saying unprecedented to describe our reality. With climate change accelerating the effects of imperialism and capitalism, the future is looking more violent for most people on the planet right now. We are truly in times of profound change and transformation. This fall, it's unclear whether it'll be October or November, we're figuring it out, I will be presenting my next report to the UN General Assembly on the topic of the right to food and starvation, with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. This is an opportunity for all of us to gather and mobilize. There'll be other special rapporteurs present. Much of what I have to say comes from working on that report, but that report is still a work in progress, so my ideas are still not entirely fully formed. There's a call for input from people. I do read all of them, so really these are ideas that are dynamic. So 9 months, we're about a little shy of 9 months into Israel's war in Gaza, and I want to take this gathering with you as an important moment to reflect. I don't want to speak with the voice of authority that comes with holding this mandate. I'm exhausted, as everyone is. After 241 days of witnessing Israel's starvation campaign and genocide in Gaza on a daily basis, I've been trying to find a moment to reflect, to give myself the grace and space to change. There's no way I'm the same person I was 9 months ago. And it's only in this space of friendship, I'm really tired, huh? It's only in this space of friendship and camaraderie can I allow myself to be vulnerable enough to change how I think about things. and how I think about my place in the world. I didn't expect this, huh? Only in this space of friendship and camaraderie can I keep my mind and heart open enough to see clearly and not think from a place of anger or fear. In the past few months, I've been calling for action, chastising governments for only offering empty words, frustrated with international courts for only offering garbled words, frustrated with politicians for only offering dishonest words. But I think I made a mistake. My mistake was I was making too hard of a distinction between words and action. I wanted to see something. A ceasefire, humanitarian aid through land routes, political and economic sanctions against Israel, the ending of US, Canadian, and European military and financial support to Israel. And I still believe those things must happen. But sometimes saying something, saying the right thing at the right time is action. Like when I tell my son, I love you, Habibi. It's the most powerful thing you can do sometimes. And I have to admit, over the last 9 months, every time I embrace my son, I do it for a couple seconds extra. Every time I say, Inta Habibi, I say it with a bit more intentionality. In fact, sometimes not saying something is the most powerful thing you can do. It can be the most powerful way to express your solidarity, if not your love. Like when someone is so hurt that what they need for you is to listen to their story. In those moments, you hold a space for that person so that you can listen with your entire being. I haven't cried in 9 months. Oh, fuck. Fuck, we all need it, don't we? Ugh. Yalla, meshi. You hold a space for that person so you can listen with your entire being without cluttering that space with solutions or even solace. You have to make that space as safe and intimate as possible for them, specifically for them. And so you go into that intimate moment where you are listening to someone's story, knowing that you will never be the same after hearing their story, after they've shared their experience, their knowledge, they've gifted you with their story. All you know is that your relationship to that person or their people will change forever. My point is, I don't think change happens by necessarily doing something, that thing or that other thing. I definitely don't think change or implementing law in a particular way necessarily leads to meaningful change that reconfigures power. Change happens by changing our relationships with each other, with ourselves, with our past, or by creating new relationships. All of us now, meeting here in this room right now, we are already a force of change. The student encampments across universities in North America and the world are already a powerful force of change for solidarity and liberation for the Palestinian people, regardless of the nature of the negotiations or resistance against university administrators and the police. So now you know who I am, and you know where I'm speaking from, so I'm going to outline the plan for the rest of the evening. I want to first address the concept of genocide and why it is important to understand what Israel is doing right now against the Palestinian people is genocide. Mishmishki. I'll then connect it to the notion of starvation. I will explain how the definition of starvation in international law has certain limits. And then I'll highlight how to think about broadening that definition. This focus on words and framing is not a semantic exercise. How we name horror determines how we overcome that horror. The stakes are very high over how we name and understand Israel's horrors against the Palestinian people. And I'll conclude with how the response to genocide and starvation is addressing the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. I'll quickly explain what food sovereignty means. So I keep pressing the time and it doesn't work. There we go. I'll explain what food sovereignty means and what it means for the Palestinian people from my experiences. So to begin with genocide, in the early days of this war on October 15th, because of the work of many people in this room, over 400 scholars in the fields of international law, genocide studies, Holocaust studies, raised the alarm that Israel is probably committing genocide in Gaza. Soon after, on October 19th, several special rapporteurs followed suit calling for the prevention of genocide. My mandate is food. There's over 40 other mandates. We were the first as special rapporteurs, and I think we remain the only, if I'm not mistaken, we were the first and probably only voices within the UN system framing the issue as a matter of genocide. And I can tell you early on, we were having huge debates amongst different special rapporteurs. Many of our colleagues signed our press release a little bit later, or later understood it as genocide. That took time for others. And I think those of us that saw it so early amongst the special rapporteurs were able to do so for a couple of reasons. First, I think our mandates allowed us to see it. In some ways, thanks, Habibti. In some ways, it's telling who were the first mandate holders that raised the alarm. Food, water, housing, and health. And I'm going to come back to that. There's something really core about those ideas, those mandates. These are the mandates which are the essentials of life. We were also supported by the mandate holders that address violence against women and internally displaced people, and of course the mandate holder addressing occupied Palestinian territories. The second reason I think we were able to see it so quickly is an understanding of geography and history. Those of us who know that this did not start on October 7th or in Gaza could see genocide for what it was. We understood that this was a case of settler colonialism, of creating 75 years of apartheid, 56 years of belligerent occupation of Palestinian territory, and 16 years of a siege against Gaza. And the third reason those of us that were able to see it so quickly, I think, was from experience. More people than you think have experienced genocide. And what I mean by that is genocide does not affect just those people that were killed. Genocide creates a social trauma that overwhelms time and space. Genocide resonates across an entire region and throughout multiple generations, sometimes reproducing and magnifying hate. Anyone who is indigenous, like the Lenape people on whose territory we are on right now, anyone from the former Yugoslavia or from Rwanda has experienced genocide. Anyone who is Armenian experienced genocide and experienced it again in Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan not too long ago. The Uyghur people, the Rohingya, Black South Africans, Namibians, people of the Congo, other communities in Africa and the Black diaspora. Anyone who has been at war with Israel knows what is genocide. And there are many other instances that I have not listed that may not have been officially recognized or even captured in history or in time. Genocidal tendencies are more common than is publicly discussed. That's a lot of people. That's why millions of people immediately took to the streets all over the world in October, not only calling for a ceasefire, but to an end of the genocide. 9 months later, I don't need to walk through why this is a genocide. The degree of carnage against the Palestinian people, simply because they are Palestinian, is getting harder and harder to even describe. When the dust settles, those of us who have not been in Gaza may fully realize the horror and carnage and the degree of violence that is possible today. So I'm not going to spend time arguing that this is genocide. The onus is on them. And I'll turn now to starvation. What's going on? Like I said, we've never seen an entire civilian population made to go hungry this so quickly and so completely. Israel declared its campaign to starve the Palestinian people on October 9 2008 and 9, and repeatedly since. In January, we started seeing the effects of Israel's starvation campaign unfold at rates we have never seen in any place or any time. By December, I could publicly say that every single person in Gaza, 2.3 million people, were going hungry, the majority of which were children. And let's remember who suffers first. It's always people that have been made vulnerable. So women, people with disabilities, older persons. From December to March, the number of people facing famine almost doubled. In 1 month, this was from about February to March, we saw the rate of children suffering from acute malnutrition or wasting double across all of Gaza, with the worst rates in the north and central Gaza. Starting in February, children started to die from malnutrition, dehydration, and starvation. When this starts to happen, you know that famine is already occurring or just around the corner. You don't need to wait for the famine experts. And they'll tell you that. You don't need the experts to tell you, yes, we've measured and there is famine. In northern Gaza, there is famine. With a brutal onslaught in Rafah, famine is probably already there. Because of the lack of nutrition, a whole generation is now in danger of suffering permanent physical and cognitive impairment, what doctors call stunting. For those children to be able to live a life with dignity, they're going to need a lot of help. Israel has denied and restricted humanitarian aid throughout this entire war. They've used humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip. I've laid out those details in my other work, so I won't go into those details today. I suspect more people in Gaza will die from hunger and malnutrition than from bombs and bullets. So let me connect this to the right to food. Starvation is defined in international law today as a war crime. That's something very particular to say it's a war crime. I'm planning to argue in my report that starvation is not just a war crime, but it is a fundamental violation of international law writ large. Since my mandate is the right to food, let me briefly explain what this right to food thing is. The right to food is the right to be free from hunger, which means it's the right to be free from oppression, exploitation, and occupation. People never go hungry because there's not enough food. Hunger is always caused by political choices. So the right to food is the right to feed ourselves and feed each other, whether by working the land, through foraging, fishing, and hunting, or it's about making sure markets are fair and stable, that we have the time to go buy our food, to cook, or occasionally even go out to eat. And it's not just about any food. It's not about calories. People have the right to good food and to decide what is good food. That is, they get to decide what food is culturally, nutritionally, and ecologically adequate. It's about what's at stake is a life with dignity. Starvation is the most extreme form of hunger. Starvation is a way of trying to describe death from hunger. And it's the result of long-standing structural issues. Starvation is the product of political choices. Starvation is therefore always predictable and preventable. The right to food, as I said, is the right to be free from hunger. And that notion of freedom, I want to sort of hold it to the end. So as I said, starvation isn't really addressed very clearly in the world of human rights. It's left and put into this other category of war crimes and humanitarian aid. So the way it's defined in international humanitarian law, which is also known as the laws of war and international criminal law, in the Geneva Convention, starvation is actually interestingly broad. It's about attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. That's it. Broadly, it's not just about food. Objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And the laws of war are generally about managing violence. It's not about ending war, and making this distinction between who's an armed combatant and who's a civilian. And that similar prohibition is in the Rome Statute, which is the International Criminal Court, and it's also in the UN's Genocide Convention. So in general, a starvation crime must meet a threshold of scale. There has to be some significant number of people affected, and severity, some measure of deaths or severe suffering. And it must be perpetrated in an orchestrated manner. There must be some intentionality. Now, in terms of intent, all you have to show is that the actors knew their actions would result in starvation. Recently, the International Criminal Court prosecutor has raised the issue of, the issue of starvation, and he's going through the process of trying to get warrants issued, charging some individuals on starvation, with no mention of genocide or apartheid, ignoring the wide range of systemic issues. The fact that the prosecutor of the ICC is trying to issue these warrants as a war crime has its benefits, great, but by not addressing genocide and apartheid, it limits the chances of the ICC being a forum for Palestinian liberation. It becomes a very narrow tactical moment that, sure, maybe we can try and take advantage of, but it's not going to give us a big picture advantage. More generally, criminal law, especially international criminal law, is a very weak deterrent. So even if certain individuals are found guilty, this won't address the system that allowed for starvation to happen. How was this possible? How did these individuals deploy a starvation campaign so quickly and with such effective intensity? No matter how horrible and evil you are, you need the machinery to starve a people like this. So the problem, I think, isn't just that international humanitarian law and international criminal law can't stop starvation. The laws of war enable starvation. They increase the chances of it happening. And I'll explain how. In the laws of war, you're allowed to starve your enemy, the armed combatant that you are fighting. But then the rule says, but you're not allowed to starve civilians. This is the fantasy. The way war works and the world works is there is rarely a distinction or such a hard distinction between supply chains for the military, supply chains for humanitarian relief, and supply chains for civilians. They're often interconnected. In fact, sometimes in times of war, some civilian populations have better access to food. Saying there is war and not war tells you nothing. In Lebanon, during the civil war, we experienced hunger, but we experienced the worst situation of hunger just a couple of years ago. War creates its own supply chains, and they're usually very efficient. So the laws of war say, oh, you can't starve civilians, but you can starve the enemy. You starve your enemy, you're starving everybody. And it allows you then to make these arguments that Israel is making and others are making. So the power of situating, why it matters then to situate starvation in the context of genocide, you kind of pull it a little bit out of this international laws of war sort of situation into genocide. There are no exceptions to genocide. Oh, I meant to genocide the armed combatants, not the civilians. You can't do it. There's just a blanket prohibition. And starvation is usually driven by genocidal intent. There's a deep interconnectedness between those practices. But, and this is what I'm trying to do in this report, there's something unique to starvation that I think is worth capturing and explaining, and this is where my work is going. There's a particular cruelty, a particular form of violence with its own pace, its own form, that's slow at first. And this I'm borrowing from comrades in the world of climate change. A slow violence that isn't as spectacular enough to make the international institutional machinery do anything. And then it unfolds in its own way. Until Gaza, it would unfold very slowly. Humanitarian workers and starvation experts describe to me how starvation used to strike And it was this slow-moving thing, and they were getting frustrated that the humanitarian relief wasn't coming in. And they said it's like this tsunami in slow motion. That's how starvation used to work. Gaza, the speed was, people didn't know how to process it. And it affects you biophysically for your entire life, if you survive. It seems that it affects our genes, how our genes are expressed, and how when we have children, how the genetic makeup of our children. So it affects future generations. But it's its own form of social trauma. It carries with it a degree of shame. And this I've only learned recently. Parents have to decide, which child do I feed first, or how much? Who in the family gets to eat? People have to turn away neighbors, knowing that by turning away their neighbor, that's a death sentence. Maybe you turned away your neighbor, and someone in their family dies, and you all survive, and you're still neighbors. You carry that shame with you for generations. This is why in Ireland, after the Great Famine caused by the British, it took generations for the Irish to figure out and to be able to talk about the Great Famine in a more public way. So let me conclude with what I'm doing now over the next few weeks. I'm finalizing the report. And I'm trying in this report, like I said, to say that starvation is a fundamental violation of all of international law, but I'm also trying to really connect the right to food and starvation conceptually, because there's no clear connection in practice or in law. And in fact, also the two configurations, starvation and the right to food, are two different configurations of institutions, experts, and social movements. So there's two different communities of practice around these ideas. So the right to food usually entails a focus on human rights and food security, and then starvation tends to be addressed as a matter of humanitarian aid, armed conflict, and international criminal law. And I want to sort of bring these together, both conceptually and in practice. So I've been inviting those two communities to come together. And so the idea is, in the report, if we can establish a relationship between the right to food and the prevention of starvation in a way that is dedicated to the common goal of ensuring that everyone has the power to determine what is good food for their community and to access that food. I focus on food, but like I said, starvation also denies people's rights to water, health, and housing. If I stay in this human rights world, I think that's just where I'm going to hang out forever, around those four concepts. I've learned by bearing witness to Israel's genocide in Gaza that the rights to food, water, health, and housing are deeply interconnected and collectively form the core of the rights to life and self-determination. Self-determination in the context of food, I think, is best articulated in this concept, this term, this movement, food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is an expression of a community's or indigenous people's power to determine how they make food, share food, eat food, a reflection of their relationship to land and water. The more that power is equitably shared amongst all people in a food system, the more likely that people will always have access to good food. The more that people will have a relationship with land and water that is based on care and reciprocity. And that makes it easier for people to establish relationships with each other based on care and reciprocity. The food sovereignty movement starts in the mid-90s. It's primarily a peasant-driven movement connecting Latin American peasant movements and European peasants. And they take on this political identity of the peasant, al-Fallah. Their main target in the 90s was the World Trade Organization, and they were part of big anti-globalization movements. They quickly broadened their movement both geographically and institutionally, and then started to engage in UN institutions, primarily the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and the UN Committee on World Food Security, both based in Rome. The food sovereignty movement now is composed of two big networks. The International Planning Committee on Food Sovereignty, known as the IPC, and the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty. Over drinks, I can explain why they don't hang out and don't get along. It's the nature of movements, right? In Palestine, the two, I think, biggest groups that engage with food sovereignty, and I learned a lot from my relationship with these organizations. There's the Union of Agricultural Work committees, and the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature. But there's many practices of food sovereignty, whether we call it that or not. Seed banks, saving seeds, foraging, etc. So the report that I'm working on focuses on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty, since the Palestinian liberation struggle against different forms of colonialism most clearly highlights how starvation, let's frame it as a human rights issue. This is a tactical move I'm making. Words cannot capture certain aspects of the horror that's happening, but words cannot capture food sovereignty because food sovereignty is an existential and cultural issue. And so part of the report will be in the form of a comic drawn by my friend Omar Khouri. Because we wanted to, there's a limit to text. And that's something we're playing with as an idea. So as I mentioned, Israel is committing genocide and is mounting a starvation campaign. To understand how that's happening and how to resist, this is how I think food sovereignty might help. When you examine the situation in terms of Palestinian people's food sovereignty, you get a better understanding of what is at stake. Israel is not only restricting or blocking the flow of humanitarian aid, it's targeting the food system itself in Gaza. It's making it impossible for people to feed themselves now and very difficult for people to feed themselves in the future. Israel is poisoning agricultural land, decimating orchards, destroying greenhouses, decimating fishing fleets. The reason Israel could make 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza go hungry so quickly and completely is because Israel was already strangling Gaza through a 17-year blockade, keeping everyone on the precipice of hunger by calculating the exact number of calories that were allowed in that avoided international alarm. International law only responds when it's this spectacular, right? Before the war, 50% of people in Gaza were food insecure and 80% were dependent on humanitarian aid. And so Israel's attacks aren't just against Gaza, it's against the Palestinian people. It's an attack it's an attempt to undermine their food sovereignty. Last year and now going into this year, we are seeing record degrees of violence by Israeli settlers, supported by Israeli armed forces, against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. There's an escalation of attacks against Palestinian peasants and pastoralists. This year, many peasants were not able to harvest their olives in the West Bank. Olives, of course, are an important source of food and livelihood, but the Palestinian people's relationship to olive trees, which can live for hundreds of years, is about the Palestinian people's relationship to their land, to their ancestors, and to their future. The olive tree is one central aspect of what it means to be Palestinian and Palestinian food sovereignty. I'll add that small-scale fishing and access to the Mediterranean Sea is another central aspect of Palestinian food sovereignty. We can't imagine Gaza without fishing. We can't imagine all of Palestine without access to the sea and fishing. The third component, then, to broaden out, is the attack against UNRWA. Based on unsubstantiated claims by Israel, all of a sudden, Israel's allies threaten and actually defund UNRWA, punishing all Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, West Bank, occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Not only threatening the food security of the Palestinian refugees, but also undermining the fact that UNRWA carries the property deeds for many of these Palestinians. And I thank Zaina for highlighting that for me. That's an attack against the people themselves. So food sovereignty allows us to appreciate that this isn't an Israeli war in Gaza. This is an Israeli war against the Palestinians for being Palestinian, regardless of where they live right now. Food sovereignty also gives us a better sense of time. Palestinians have been fighting against colonialism, not just in the form of being disposed from their land. Of course, that is a brutal way of being occupied and dispossessed. But they've been fighting to maintain a particular kind of relationship with their land. Colonialism, dispossession, and dislocation doesn't just happen by being kicked out of your home. That was and remains a powerful way of attacking Palestinians. But it also, colonialism, dispossession, and dislocation also happens by undoing people's relationship to the land, undoing their relationship to the rivers and the seas, so that they can no longer feed themselves. This happened here in North America, and again to the Lenape people of this territory. Since at least 1917 in the British Balfour Declaration, you can see a continuous history that reaches into today of laws and policies created to disrupt and deny Palestinians' ability to grow food, to forage, to fish, and to hunt. Laws and policies that deny Palestinians the conditions to work with dignity in the food and agricultural sector, to deny Palestinians the ability to trade internationally, to continue the passing of traditional knowledge, to develop new knowledge and technology, or to save and share seeds. Moreover, the Israeli food system itself does not just produce food, it produces violence against Palestinians. It is a source of exploitation, oppression, and occupation of the Palestinian people. It's not just that they steal our food. As Lebanese, I can say our food on this one. When I've been thinking about the Palestinian people's food sovereignty, again, Zain Jalad has reminded me what is at stake is the Palestinian people's right of return and their claim to their territory. And again, it's not just any territory. The right of return includes a right of return to a territory that can feed its people. To put it another way, the right of return is not an abstract concept, but a right that enshrines people's long-standing relationship to the land, and food is an expression of that relationship. So here I'll end. For the Palestinian people, then, every meal becomes a reiteration of that right of return. The power and authority of food sovereignty does not derive from the political form of the state or any particular national authority. One state, two state, whatever. Many people have some sort of state to call their own and are still facing high degrees of hunger, malnutrition, and oppression, exploitation, occupation. Food sovereignty arises from people's long-standing relationship with the land, with the rivers and the sea, and their ability to feed their communities. Of course, the common chant is, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And as I've already mentioned, the right to food is the right to be free from hunger, to be free from oppression, exploitation, and occupation. So how do we know when we're free? Well, when we feed each other, when we can take care of each other, when we can celebrate life through our communion. In these moments of joy and pleasure, we are free. Thank you very much.